Welcome to the Deep Dive, your shortcut to being genuinely well-informed. We take the most complex and, well, overwhelming topics, distill the core facts, and give you the essential insights.
And today, we are really undertaking a monumental deep dive. It's into an enduring mystery, one that's captivated and, frankly, frustrated the nation for nearly 3 decades now.
That's right. We're talking about the 1996 murder of 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey.
This case it's just a tragically perfect storm, isn't it? A painful confluence of institutional failure, media sensationalism, really complex forensics.
And that enduring difficulty of telling grief apart from deception. It's incredibly hard.
Exactly. So our goal here is to cut through all that noise. We're using essentially 3 decades of material information spanning from the immediate, almost fatal mistakes made back then in Boulder, Colorado.
Right up to the very latest developments, like in forensic DNA tech.
Yes, exactly. As of November 2025, it's a story where the evidence, it just seems to perpetually point in 2 completely opposite directions. It's maddening.
Okay, let's unpack this right from the very beginning then. Let's set the scene. December 26, 1996. The inciting incident itself. Well, it was the start of the chaos, really.
It really was. Patsy Ramsey called 911 before dawn, reported her daughter missing, said she'd found a note demanding ransom.
And even that initial 911 call, it wasn't straightforward, was it? There were anomalies right away.
Oh, immediately. The operator, Kim Archuleta, she later testified about this. She said the phone line stayed open for several minutes after Patsy thought she'd hung up.
Okay. And she heard something.
Yes. On that open line, Archuleta claimed she heard sounds and a phrase. Something that sounded like Patsy saying, "Okay, we've called the police, now what?"
Wow. Now what?
Yeah. And crucially, the operator felt the whole conversation sounded rehearsed. That was her word. And she thought she could maybe detect 2 or even 3 distinct voices in the room with Patsy.
Rehearse. That's chilling, if true. So that initial interaction, already a red flag.
A huge one. But it was really the police response that compounded the problem, turned it into an investigative disaster, frankly.
How so? What was the fundamental mistake there?
They immediately treated it as a straightforward kidnapping, a snatch and grab scenario, not what it turned out to be, a homicide that had likely already happened inside the house.
And that assumption had massive consequences.
Devastating consequences. Look, the absolute first rule of crime scene investigation is immediate, complete security. Lock it down.
Makes sense.
The Boulder police, they failed to do this. Instead of treating the entire very large Ramsey house as a potential crime scene, they initially only blocked off JonBenét's bedroom.
Just the bedroom.
Just the bedroom. The rest of the house, think about entry points, exit points, the basement, everything, it wasn't secured.
Yeah.
And that led to massive, immediate contamination.
And the pace. Was the response quick, at least?
Shockingly slow. I mean, you have a report of a missing child, potentially kidnapped, high stakes.
Absolutely.
A full search of that large home. It didn't happen until a full 7 hours after the 911 call. 7 hours.
7 hours. That seems like an eternity in that situation.
It is. And within that time, we know a first responding officer failed to check a really key area, the basement door. Just didn't check it.
So the body was just there.
Yeah.
Undiscovered for hours.
Exactly. It meant the body remained hidden, and the chaos upstairs, the contamination, it just continued, destroying potential trace evidence.
Because they thought it was a kidnapping? They let people wander around?
Pretty much. The Ramseys themselves, friends who came over to offer support, officers moving freely through rooms. There are reports, the family friend trying to be helpful.
Oh, no.
Actually cleaned the kitchen counters.
Yeah.
With spray cleaner.
You're kidding.
No, think about that. Potential fingerprints, fibers, maybe tiny drops of blood, other biological material just wiped away.
Well,
in those critical first hours, all because of well-meaning action, sure, but forensically disastrous.
That's just staggering incompetence, or lack of procedure at least.
It set the stage for everything that followed, and the disaster was, well, truly sealed later that morning.
When John Ramsey found her.
Yes. Hours after the police first arrived, an officer actually urged John Ramsey to conduct a search of the house himself. Can you believe that? Asking the father.
He asked him to search.
Yes. And that's when he went down to the basement room, a wine cellar, actually.
And that's where he found JonBenét.
He found his daughter murdered. The autopsy later revealed the horrific details. A fractured skull from a significant blow to the head, clear signs of sexual assault.
And the garrote.
And a crude garrote wrapped around her neck. It was made from a piece of cord and the broken handle of a paintbrush found inside the house.
And John's reaction. It caused more problems for the investigation, didn't it?
It further compounded the destruction of the scene, absolutely. When he found her, his first instinct, understandably perhaps, was parental. He covered her body with a blanket
Okay.
and then immediately carried her upstairs into the living room.
Oh, wow. Moving the body.
Moving the body, essentially collapsing the primary crime scene into a family area that was already, as we've said, heavily contaminated by multiple people.
And didn't he also touch things? Evidence.
He did. He reportedly removed the piece of duct tape that had been placed over her mouth, and he even tried to untie the knot on the garrote around her neck.
Why would he? I mean, grief, obviously, but...
From a purely forensic perspective, it's the worst possible thing you can do. Moving the body, touching ligatures, touching potential weapons. It smears any potential evidence transfer. It mixes his own DNA and fingerprints with whatever the killer might have left.
It muddies everything.
Fundamentally compromises the location where the attack and murder actually took place. This level of disturbance. It just meant the forensic window was slamming shut.
Fast.
And the autopsy timing didn't help either.
No. A pathologist didn't examine the body until more than 18 hours after the crime likely took place. You lose valuable time for assessing things like rigor mortis, body temperature changes, details that help establish a clearer timeline.
It's just layer upon layer of mistakes. Absolutely. It's clear why the initial police work has been called a black mark on the Boulder Police Department. It was a massive institutional failure, and it directly contributed to the ambiguity, the confusion that clouds this case even today.
And that contamination, that ambiguity, it affects everything, doesn't it? Especially maybe the most notorious piece of evidence.
The ransom note, exactly. Which leads us perfectly into part 2, the core physical evidence, and a linguistic deep dive into that note.
Because this wasn't just any note.
No, this isn't just a 2.5-page letter. It's one of the most studied, most debated documents in modern criminal history.
So what did it actually say? The basics.
Okay, so it was this lengthy 2.5-page demand addressed specifically to John Ramsey. It instructed him to withdraw $118,000 in cash for JonBenét's safe return.
And it warned against calling the police.
Explicitly ordered him not to contact police. And the alleged kidnappers described themselves, rather strangely, as a small foreign faction.
A small foreign faction.
Yeah.
Okay, that sounds theatrical.
Exactly. And that's what immediately struck investigators as odd. Several FBI agents apparently believed the note was staged, partly because of its sheer length and these, well, bizarre contents.
How long was it compared to other ransom notes?
It's cited as the longest ransom note in FBI criminal history. Think about it. Usually a real kidnapper wants speed, anonymity. They give concise instructions, get the money, disappear.
Right. Quick and dirty.
This note was verbose, rambling almost, detailed in weird ways. It felt entirely performative, not practical.
And then there's the amount. That specific demand. $118,000. That's the real kicker, isn't it?
That is the linchpin detail. Absolutely. Precisely. That specific, almost down to the dollar amount, $118,000.
It matched his bonus.
It was almost the exact figure of John Ramsey's Christmas bonus that year, received just days before.
So the question is, how would an external small foreign faction, as they called themselves, know that?
Exactly. How would they know, down to the last dollar, the precise amount of John's recent seasonal bonus? It just screams intimate domestic knowledge of the family's finances.
Which directly contradicts the whole foreign faction claim.
Completely. It points inwards, not outwards.
And adding to that internal feel, they didn't even bring their own supplies, did they?
No. The note was written on a notepad, a legal pad found inside the Ramsey home. The pen used was also found in the house.
And there was a draft.
Yes. What appeared to be a practice attempt, or a draft, of the same letter was also discovered crumpled up in the house. Near a phone, I believe.
So the implication is, whoever wrote this spent a significant amount of time composing it inside the house, probably after the murder had already occurred.
That's the strong implication. The whole sequence just feels wrong for an outsider. Taking the time to write nearly 3 pages, carefully, with practice, leaving the body hidden in the basement instead of taking the victim, demanding an amount tied precisely to a recent bonus.
It's highly illogical for a genuine intruder focused on escape and money.
Very illogical. And this is really where that specialized science, forensic linguistics, comes into play. Trying to figure out who wrote it based on how it was written.
Okay, let's pause here because this is fascinating. Forensic linguistics, it sounds technical. Can you break that down a bit? What is it exactly?
Sure. So forensic linguistics, you can trace its application back to linguistic scholars like Smartvic in the 1960s. But essentially, it's applying knowledge about language, grammar, vocabulary, writing style, how people phrase things to legal matters.
Like figuring out who wrote something. Authorship attribution.
That's a major part of it, yes. Authorship attribution and also linguistic profiling, trying to determine characteristics of the speaker or writer based on their language use.
So how did this discipline get applied to the Ramsey ransom note? How did they try to target the writer?
Well, it focused heavily on the concept of the writer's idiolect.
Idiolect. Okay, what's that?
Your idiolect is like your unique linguistic fingerprint. It's the specific combination of grammatical structures you prefer, the vocabulary choices you make, common spelling errors you might have, your punctuation habits, all the little quirks that distinguish your writing and speaking from everyone else's.
We all have one.
We all have one. It's largely unconscious. Forensic linguists, sometimes using statistical analysis called stylometry, look for these specific, often unconscious traits to compare documents or link writing to a known author.
And the analysis linking Patsy Ramsey to this note, that's become a really significant part of the case, hasn't it? Even if it's circumstantial.
It is incredibly compelling circumstantial evidence, yes. Multiple linguistic experts and handwriting analysts, though handwriting analysis graphology is sometimes considered less scientifically rigorous than pure linguistic analysis, they cited finding over 200 similarities.
200. Similarities between what?
Between Patsy Ramsey's known handwriting samples, letters, cards, notes she had written, and the ransom note itself.
And these weren't just, like, common letters looking similar.
No, proponents of this analysis claim it went much deeper. Similarities in specific, sometimes unusual letter formations, the way she spaced words, certain stylistic deviations from standard writing, things that mirrored her known personal writing style.
And what about the language itself? The word choices?
That's where the linguistic analysis gets interesting, too. The note uses some unusual or slightly archaic phrasing, like, "Don't try to grow a brain, John."
Yeah, that's weird.
Very weird. In terms like foreign faction, hence attaché, it suggests a unique idiolect, someone perhaps trying to sound like something they're not, maybe educated or even dramatic.
So if we look at the note through that lens, text linguistics, you mentioned, the idea of intentionality, what does the note betray about the sender's real goal?
Right. Intentionality in text linguistics refers to the sender's underlying purpose or attitude towards the message and its goal. If the sender was a genuine kidnapper wanting money, the text itself had very low coherence and acceptability. It broke all the unwritten rules of a successful ransom demand.
Because it was too long, too specific, too weird.
Exactly. Which strongly suggests the real purpose wasn't successful communication to get ransom money, it was something else. Maybe an attempt to confuse investigators, deflect suspicion, or, crucially, maybe just buy time while figuring out what to do next.
So the act of writing it was part of staging the scene.
That's the theory. The criminal was attempting to disguise their linguistic identity, create a false narrative, and stage a scene suggesting an external threat.
But the irony is, trying to disguise your writing style often makes your real habits stand out more. Is that right?
That's a key concept in forensic linguistics, yes.
Yeah.
People often try to disguise their idiolect or style, but they frequently fail, especially under pressure. They make inconsistencies. They might use all caps, like in the Ramsey note, to hide handwriting. But their sentence structure, their word choices, their punctuation habits, those often slip through.
Because those are more deeply ingrained.
Exactly. The human language instinct, the way you naturally put words together, it's deep-seated. You can consciously change your handwriting to some extent, but changing your preferred syntax, your vocabulary frequencies, your use of function words, that's extremely difficult to do consistently, especially when writing something long and stressful like a ransom note.
So the note itself, despite the attempt at disguise, might actually anchor suspicion more firmly on someone within the house because the disguise failed.
That's the argument made by many analysts, yes. The linguistic evidence, combined with the circumstantial evidence, like the notepad and the bonus amount, creates a powerful, albeit not definitive, case pointing inward.
Okay, so that psychological aspect, the linguistic evidence, it forms the foundation for suspicion against the family, which brings us right into part 3. The competing theories, the suspects, and the whole psychological maze of this case.
Yeah, and the debate has always boiled down to family versus intruder. It's been the central conjugate from almost day one.
And the intruder theory had a very prominent champion, didn't it? Lou Smith.
That's right, Lou Smith. He was a retired, well-respected Colorado Springs homicide detective. The DA's office actually brought him in to take a fresh look at the case, maybe find something Boulder PD had missed.
And he came to a very different conclusion than the police.
Very different, and very quickly. Smith became convinced the Ramseys were innocent. He firmly believed the killer was an outsider, an intruder who had somehow gotten into the house. And this put him immediately at odds, quite publicly, with the Boulder Police Department, who remained largely focused on the family.
So what was Smith's reasoning? What physical evidence did he point to for this intruder?
Smith and other intruder theorists really focus on several key items found at the scene. First, there was an unidentified boot print.
Where was it found?
In the basement, near where JonBenét's body was discovered. In the dust of the wine cellar floor, it was from a high-tech brand boot.
And the Ramseys didn't own boots like that.
Reportedly, no one in the family owned a shoe matching that specific size or brand. So Smith argued it must belong to the killer.
Okay, what else?
Second, there was a piece of rope found in a guest room. The Ramseys apparently confirmed they couldn't identify it, didn't know where it came from. Smith suggested the killer might have brought materials like this, or perhaps scouted the house beforehand and left it.
And the third big piece for the intruder theory that involves how they supposedly got in or out, right?
Right.
The broken basement window.
Exactly. There was a broken window in the basement, and nearby, a suitcase had been placed directly underneath it.
Like a step.
Precisely. Smith and John Ramsey both described it as looking like it was placed there intentionally, staged as a step, to facilitate entry or exit through that window. This formed a core part of the narrative for how an outsider could have gained access.
It sounds plausible on the surface. Broken window, suitcase step, boot print inside.
It does. But then you have the counterpoint. And it's a really fascinating, often overlooked detail from the crime scene photos.
Which is?
The spider webs.
Spider webs, how do they fit in?
Crime scene photos, taken very early on, revealed intact spider webs in and around that broken basement window pane, right across the opening.
Intact, meaning undisturbed.
Exactly. This was apparently verified later by arachnologist spider experts who looked at the photos. They concluded that the delicate webbing hadn't been disturbed.
So the argument is, if someone had actually crawled through that window,
Especially an adult, squeezing through that relatively small opening, those fragile webs would almost certainly have been brushed away, broken, destroyed.
which suggests
It strongly suggests that no entry or exit was actually made through that specific broken window, despite the suitcase being placed there. It potentially undercuts a primary piece of the intruder narrative. Maybe the window was broken from the inside or at a different time.
that detail really complicates the simple intruder entry story.
It does. It's one of those small forensic nuggets that got a bit lost in the noise, but it's significant.
Okay, so if the intruder evidence has issues, let's pivot back to the family suspicion side. The arguments there seem less about single pieces of physical evidence and more psychological, behavioral.
Largely, yes. A lot of the suspicion directed at John and Patsy stemmed from their conduct, both immediately after the crime and in their subsequent public appearances, especially that early CNN interview.
What specifically drew scrutiny?
Well, the initial reaction, or perceived lack thereof. There was immense public and media commentary about Patsy Ramsey in particular, allegedly showing a lack of visible tears or overt emotion during televised interviews.
People expect a certain kind of grief reaction.
Right. Exactly. And when it doesn't conform to expectations, suspicion arises. This was coupled with what some perceived as an aggressive or defensive tone used by both John and Patsy on camera. They seemed angry, which could be grief, or it could be interpreted differently.
And there was also speculation about medication.
Yes, there was significant speculation, often quite cruel and unfounded in proof, that Patsy might have been on sedatives, maybe Xanax or Valium, during those public appearances.
Which, if true, could explain a sort of blunted affect, slurred speech, perhaps.
Potentially. It was offered by some as an explanation for her seemingly suppressed emotional state, but again, it was never definitively proven. It just added to the cloud of suspicion and public judgment.
But beyond demeanor, the core argument against the family always comes back to the idea of staging, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The concept of staging the scene is the central anchor of the family suspicion theory. Theorists, including many investigators, found it wholly illogical for a genuine kidnapper to carry out that entire sequence.
Remind us of that sequence again.
Writing the incredibly long, rambling ransom note inside the house, then brutally murdering the child, sexually assaulting her, and then hiding the body inside the house, in the basement, rather than immediately fleeing, either with or without the victim, to minimize risk.
It just doesn't track for a typical kidnapping scenario.
Not at all. Staging strongly suggests that the murder itself was an internal event, something that happened within the family. And the note, the hidden body, the garrote, the assault, these were all attempts to create a false narrative, to point the finger at a fictional outsider.
And John's specific actions when he found the body, those were also heavily scrutinized as part of this staging theory.
They were. His behavior was deemed very strange and potentially irrational by some investigators and observers.
Why strange? What would be expected?
Well, you might expect a panicked, grieving parent who finds their child like that to instinctively scream for help, to immediately notify the police officers who were already upstairs in the house.
But he didn't do that right away.
According to reports, his immediate actions were different. Removing the duct tape from her mouth, trying to untie the knot on the garrote before alerting the officers nearby, and then moving the body upstairs.
Which seemed calculated to some.
Yes. To some, it seemed inconsistent with pure, unadulterated shock and grief. It looked potentially calculated, perhaps actions aimed at obscuring evidence or altering the scene, especially given that John Ramsey, an intelligent businessman, likely understood the importance of preserving a crime scene.
It adds to that picture of things just not feeling right.
Exactly. It fuels the narrative that the scene was being manipulated.
Now, within the family suspicion umbrella, we can't ignore the theory involving the older brother, Burke. He was 9 at the time.
Correct. The theory involving Burke Ramsey is a significant, though highly sensitive, tangent.
And the key piece of circumstantial evidence often cited there is the pineapple anomaly.
The pineapple, yes. The autopsy found undigested pineapple in JonBenét's stomach.
Why is that significant?
Because the timeline was critical. John Ramsey initially stated that JonBenét went straight to bed after they returned home from a Christmas party late on the 25th, and apparently no pineapple was served at that party.
Okay, so she ate it after getting home.
It would seem so. And Patsy Ramsey testified in depositions that pineapple wasn't something JonBenét typically ate, but it was a favorite snack of Burke's. There was a bowl of pineapple left out in the kitchen.
So the implication is Burke was awake, and maybe they shared it, or argued over it.
That's where it leads. Adding to this, Burke himself revealed much later in a 2016 TV interview that he had actually gotten out of bed that night after everyone was supposedly asleep. He said he went downstairs to play with some new Christmas presents.
So he was awake and moving around the house, near the kitchen, potentially near JonBenét.
Correct. This detail, the pineapple, Burke being awake, provides the foundation for what became known as the accidental death theory involving Burke.
This was the theory pushed by that CBS documentary series in 2016.
Yes, that program brought it to mainstream attention. They theorized, based on analysis by their panel of experts, that Burke might have accidentally, perhaps in anger over the pineapple or something else, struck his sister with a heavy object, like a flashlight found at the scene,
Accidentally killing her.
accidentally causing the fatal head injury. And that the parents, John and Patsy, discovering this horrific accident, then allegedly staged the entire kidnapping scene, the ransom note, the garrote, the sexual assault to protect their surviving child and divert suspicion.
That's a horrifying scenario.
It's a deeply disturbing theory, and it's important to note it is just a theory. Burke Ramsey vehemently denied it and actually sued CBS over that program.
And that lawsuit was settled, right?
Yes, the case was settled out of court in 2019. The terms weren't disclosed. Furthermore, some experts argue, statistically, it would be quite unusual for a 9-year-old boy not only to accidentally kill someone, but then also to be involved in or aware of such an elaborate cover-up involving staging sexual assault and using a complex garrote.
So that theory remains highly contentious.
Yeah.
Plausible to some, utterly unbelievable to others.
Very much so. It adds another layer of tragic possibility to an already complex case.
Okay, stepping away from the family theories for a moment.
Yeah.
There was one very public suspect who actually confessed. John Mark Carr.
Ah, yes. The John Mark Carr episode in 2006. That was quite the media circus.
Who was he? What was his deal?
Carr was, essentially, a school teacher with a history of inappropriate interest in children, a known pedophile. He had become completely obsessed with the JonBenét Ramsey case over the years.
And he confessed? From where?
He was living in Thailand at the time. He started corresponding with a professor in Colorado who was researching the case, Michael Tracy. And in these communications, Carr eventually confessed to killing JonBenét, claiming her death was an accident during some kind of sexual encounter.
And this led to his arrest.
A very high-profile arrest and extradition from Thailand back to Boulder in August 2006. It was global news. For a brief moment, it seemed like the case might finally be solved.
But his confession, it raises questions about false confessions, right? Why would someone confess to a murder they didn't commit?
Yeah.
Especially such a notorious one.
Absolutely. Carr's case is almost a textbook example for discussing the psychology of false confessions, particularly in high-profile crimes. Experts usually point to two main reasons why people do this.
What are they?
First, there's a pathological need for fame, attention, or even infamy. Some people crave the spotlight, even a negative one. High-profile unsolved crimes, like the Black Dahlia murder or this one, often attract these kinds of false confessors. Carr definitely seemed to fit this profile. He was described as utterly obsessed with the case, studying minute details for years. He appeared to be soaking up the massive global attention his confession brought.
He enjoyed the notoriety.
It certainly seemed that way. The second common reason for false confessions is police coercion, intense interrogation, leading someone to confess falsely. That was less likely here, as Carr confessed relatively willingly while he was still abroad, communicating with the professor.
So he'd immersed himself so deeply in the case details, he maybe started to believe he was actually involved.
It seems possible. He appeared to have confused his obsessive fantasy with reality, but when his story was actually tested against the hard evidence, it fell apart very quickly.
How so? What didn't match up?
Well, crucially, DNA testing. Samples were taken from Carr, and they definitively failed to link him to any of the unknown male DNA found at the crime scene. That was the nail in the coffin for his claim.
And were there other problems with his story?
Yes, several. He apparently had a solid alibi placing him states away in Georgia or Alabama with his family during Christmas 1996. His story about the events of the murder itself was riddled with inconsistencies and errors. He reportedly couldn't even get the Ramseys' names right initially.
And the sexual assault claim?
He claimed he'd had sex with JonBenét, but the forensic evidence from the autopsy showed no semen was present on her body or clothing. His narrative just didn't match the physical facts.
So he was definitively ruled out.
Completely and publicly ruled out. The charges were dropped, and he was eventually released. The whole saga ended up being a strange, distracting, and ultimately fruitless detour in the investigation.
But that car incident, that media frenzy,
Right.
it really highlights another huge aspect to this case, doesn't it? The role of the media itself. Which brings us to part 4.
Yeah.
The media firestorm and the seemingly endless quest for closure.
Oh, absolutely. You really can't talk about the JonBenét case without talking about the media. It was immense. Following closely on the heels of the O.J. Simpson trial in the early 90s, this case really helped usher in what some sources have called a whole new era of irresponsible journalism.
How so? What changed?
The 24-hour cable news cycle was really taking off. There was this insatiable demand for content, for updates, for any angle on the story. And, opinion, speculation, and sometimes outright sensationalism began to aggressively overtake careful, fact-based reporting.
The media wasn't just reporting the story, they were almost driving it, shaping it.
Driving it, shaping it, and often crossing ethical lines in the process. Cable programs, tabloid shows, even daytime talk shows, they pushed boundaries relentlessly. I mean, there was literally a mock trial of John and Patsy Ramsey held on a daytime chat show.
A mock trial on TV? Seriously?
Seriously. And the way JonBenét's participation in child beauty pageants was covered, often presented with obscene, overly sexualized interpretations, it was often quite exploitative.
What were the consequences of that kind of coverage? For the investigation? For the family?
The consequences were just devastating, really, on multiple levels. The media frenzy absolutely fueled the court of public opinion, which, let's be honest, largely convicted the Ramseys almost from day one, long before any real evidence was fully processed or understood.
And the authorities didn't help.
Well, that's another layer. The situation was reportedly exacerbated by leaks from within the Boulder authorities, police, or the DA's office, sometimes feeding false, incomplete, or biased stories to the press. Whether intentional or not, it created this firestorm of speculation and accusation.
Which must have hindered any objective search for the truth.
Severely. It arguably created tunnel vision for both the public and maybe even parts of the investigation itself. If the focus is almost exclusively on the family, because that's the narrative being pushed, other crucial investigative avenues, potential leads related to an intruder, might have been neglected or ignored early on.
So the public perception was heavily skewed by the media circus. But the actual legal reality, that was much more complex, wasn't it? Especially regarding indictments or exonerations.
Extremely complex and often starkly different from what people thought was happening. The history of potential indictment and eventual exoneration is really quite convoluted.
Let's talk about the grand jury. That happened in 1999. What was the outcome there?
Right. A grand jury was convened, and they heard evidence for months. And in October 1999, that grand jury actually did vote to indict John and Patsy Ramsey.
They voted to indict on
Right.
what charges?
The charges weren't made public for many years, but we now know they voted to indict both parents on felony charges of child abuse resulting in death and also aiding and abetting a crime, essentially placing JonBenét in a situation that ultimately caused her death.
So the grand jury thought there was enough evidence.
They clearly believed there was probable cause to move forward with charges. However, and this is the crucial, controversial part, the district attorney at the time, Alex Hunter, had the sole legal power to actually sign off on those indictments and file the charges.
And he didn't.
He refused to sign the true bill. He announced publicly that he didn't believe there is sufficient evidence to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt in a trial, so he wasn't going to pursue the indictment voted on by the grand jury.
Wait, a grand jury votes to indict based on the evidence they saw, but the DA just overrides it. How common is that?
It's highly unusual, and it was deeply controversial at the time and remains so. Critics argued vociferously that the Ramseys' wealth, their high-powered legal team, and their social standing in Boulder played a decisive role.
The suggestion being that Hunter maybe feared losing a high-profile case against a wealthy family.
That was the argument. That he perhaps feared attempting to prosecute them with what was largely circumstantial evidence and potentially facing an embarrassing loss. His public stance was about the burden of proof, beyond a reasonable doubt, is a much higher bar than the grand jury's probable cause, but the refusal to sign fueled speculation about influence.
So the indictment basically just disappeared. It was neutralized.
Essentially, yes. It remained sealed and unknown to the public for over a decade. It was a legal bombshell that never officially exploded at the time.
Then fast forward almost a decade to 2008. The case took another huge turn with a different DA, Mary Lacy.
Right. In 2008, then District Attorney Mary Lacy made a very public announcement. She formally cleared John Ramsey, Patsy Ramsey, who had sadly passed away from cancer by then, and their son, Burke Ramsey, of any involvement in JonBenét's death.
Cleared them. Based on what? The investigation was still open.
Her decision was based entirely on new interpretations of the DNA evidence, specifically the unidentified male DNA found on JonBenét's underwear and long johns. Lacy stated that advances in DNA testing, specifically touch DNA analysis, made it clear that this DNA belonged to an unknown male perpetrator, and therefore the family members could not have been involved and should be formally exonerated in the eyes of the law. She even wrote them a personal letter of apology.
That sounds definitive. Did it change public perception?
Not really, no. While it was a significant legal statement, critics immediately pointed out potential issues. For one, Mary Lacy was known to have a friendly relationship with the Ramsey family.
Raising questions about bias.
Raising questions about her impartiality, yes.
Yeah.
Also, the science of touch DNA was still relatively new and sometimes controversial regarding its interpretation, especially with potentially mixed or degraded samples. So while it was an official clearing, it did very little to shift the deeply entrenched public suspicion that had been built up over years of media coverage.
So this DNA, it's the piece that exonerated them legally, but it's also the piece that remains the biggest challenge today.
Precisely. And this brings us right up to the present day, November 2025, and the persistent, incredibly frustrating challenge of that key DNA evidence. This is the biological evidence that points outside the family, the evidence Lacy used for exoneration, and it's now seen by many, including John Ramsey, as the sole remaining hope for solving this case.
Okay, so where exactly was this unidentified male DNA found? Let's recap that.
It was found in at least 2 key locations on JonBenét's clothing, inside her underwear, and on the waistband of her long johns. There's also some found under her fingernails, although that's often more complex to interpret.
And John Ramsey believes there's more DNA, untested.
He has publicly claimed that the garrote itself also contained unidentified male DNA, but he believes that specific crucial piece of evidence was never properly tested using the most advanced modern sequencing techniques. He, along with others, is now advocating very strongly for this advanced testing to finally utilize what they see as this critical biological link to the killer.
So why hasn't it been done yet? We hear about cold cases being solved all the time now with genetic genealogy, like the Golden State Killer case. Why not here? What's the main scientific hurdle?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The main hurdle appears to be the quality and complexity of the DNA sample itself. Experts who have knowledge of the case evidence, including people like former Denver DA Mitch Morrissey, who is familiar with forensic DNA, caution that the sample recovered is likely what's called a mixture.
A mixture, meaning
Meaning it potentially contains DNA from more than one person. At a minimum, it would likely be JonBenét's DNA mixed with the perpetrator's DNA. It could even be more complex if there was contamination during the initial investigation, which we know was a huge problem.
and mixtures are harder to analyze.
Much harder, especially if the sample is also small, degraded after nearly 30 years, and possibly contaminated. Think about it. You have tiny amounts of genetic material, possibly broken down over time, and you need to cleanly separate the perpetrator's profile from the victim's and potentially from any other contaminants.
So the technology exists, genetic genealogy, linking DNA through ancestry databases, but the input might not be good enough.
That seems to be the critical limiting factor. To perform genetic genealogy effectively, you ideally need a reasonably high-quality, single-source DNA profile of the unknown individual. If investigators try to run advanced sequencing or genealogy searches on a really low-level, degraded, complex mixture,
They risk using up the sample.
exactly, they risk consuming the limited physical DNA evidence that remains, potentially forever, if the test fails or yields an uninterpretable result. It's an incredibly high-stakes decision. It requires extreme caution and access to the absolute most cutting-edge sequencing and analysis technology available, which might still be insufficient for such a difficult sample.
So it's a calculated risk they haven't been willing, or perhaps able, to take yet.
It seems that way, though the pressure is mounting. Jon Ramsey, despite all the years of frustration and setbacks, remains publicly optimistic. He continues to advocate very strongly for this advanced testing, believing it's the most likely way to get a solution and finally bring some measure of closure.
And is there any movement on the official side from Boulder PD?
There does seem to be some renewed momentum, or at least public statements suggesting it. The Boulder Police Department is under new leadership now, with Chief Maris Harold, and before her, Stephen Redfern was making similar statements. They've publicly acknowledged the case as a black mark on the department's history and state they are reinvigorating efforts.
What does reinvigorating mean in practice?
Well, they maintain the investigation is open and ongoing. They say they're working with the FBI and leading DNA experts nationally and internationally. They also mention following recommendations from a Colorado cold case review team, although those specific recommendations haven't been made public.
And Jon Ramsey mentioned evidence being sent somewhere recently.
Yes, he stated fairly recently that some evidence was sent to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, CBI, for more testing. He described this as an encouraging step.
So, are investigators hopeful? Is there a timeline?
Officials have expressed cautious optimism. There have been statements suggesting that solving the case might be within reach, perhaps by 2025 or 2026, largely pinning those hopes on a potential breakthrough in genetic technology that will finally allow them to successfully separate, sequence, and identify a suspect from that complex DNA mixture.
It all hinges on that tiny biological sample, doesn't it?
The stakes are unbelievably high. After nearly 3 decades, this may truly be the final, best opportunity to solve the case using biological evidence, relying on a microscopic trace to hopefully overcome the massive challenges created by the initial investigation failures and the years of public spectacle.
Okay, so let's try to synthesize this. Nearly 30 years of complexity. What are the core takeaways here?
Well, you have an initial investigation that was, by almost all accounts, riddled with incompetence. Scene contamination, delayed search, critical oversights.
Then you have the evidence itself pointing in conflicting directions.
Exactly. You have strong forensic linguistic evidence, the bizarre ransom note, the staging elements, the specific bonus amount, all pointing strongly towards someone internal to the house, likely within the family.
But
then you have the key biological evidence, that persistent, unidentified male DNA found on her clothing pointing definitively externally towards an unknown intruder.
it's this fundamental conflict that keeps the case unresolved.
It is. And the central enduring tragedy, really, is that the initial failures of those first responders, the inability to properly secure the crime scene, prevent contamination, conduct a timely search, allowed this ambiguity, this conflict in the evidence, to take root and persist for 3 decades.
And the authorities now are still dealing with the fallout from 1996.
They are wrestling with the consequences of those original errors. They're pinning their hopes on incredibly advanced technology to provide the definitive answer that basic, competent human investigation failed to deliver back in December 1996. The case remains fractured, caught between strong behavioral suspicion and seemingly definitive but so far unusable biological proof.
Which leaves us, and you the listener, with a really provocative final thought to consider. Think about this. Despite what many see as overwhelming circumstantial and forensic linguistic evidence suggesting internal involvement, the note, the staging, the behavior, even that unusual grand jury situation, the mere presence of that unidentified male DNA has consistently shifted the focus, legally and often publicly, back towards an unknown intruder.
So the question becomes, how much does the ultimate outcome of a major criminal investigation, especially one involving influential and wealthy individuals, depend not necessarily on the weight of all evidence, including behavioral and circumstantial, but perhaps almost solely on the initial competence and impartiality of the very first responders on the scene?
And maybe on the subsequent willingness or unwillingness of official agencies to acknowledge and correct those initial, potentially fatal errors. How much does that initial fumble dictate the entire trajectory of justice?
It forces you to reflect on the very nature of justice when the starting line itself is so deeply compromised. Those first few hours. The failures there meant the unadulterated truth might have been lost almost immediately. And now, decades later, we're relying on a microscopic, mixed, degraded DNA sample to try and salvage what should have been secured right then and there on December 26, 1996.
A difficult, deeply unsettling story that unfortunately continues to haunt us. Thank you for joining us on this very deep dive.